Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Young-Kyo Kim. South Korean President Moon Jae-in addressed the UN and repeated the call for a declaration to formally end the Korean War. And the US continued to emphasize dialogue and diplomacy with North Korea. In response to this, North Korea sent mixed messages, first saying it is premature to discuss such a declaration, and then later said it is an admirable idea. Today we'll discuss what North Korea's intentions are and where things are headed. Joining me is Patricia Kim. Dr. Kim is a fellow at Brookings Institution and a global fellow at the Wilson Center. Her research focuses on U.S. alliance management in East Asia and regional security dynamics on the Korean Peninsula. Scott Snyder is also with me today. Mr. Snyder is Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of South Korean foreign policy. Welcome to the program. Good to have you both.
Thank you.
Young-Kyo.
North Korea sent two different messages on the same day. We'll talk about this just in a minute, but let's first start with South Korean President Moon Jae-in's speech at the United Nations General Assembly. Dr. Kim, President Moon said a formal end to the Korean War should be declared. It's not the first time he suggested this. Was anything different this time?
Thanks, Young-Kyo. So President Moon did indeed make a case for declaring a formal end to the Korean War at the UN this week. And his speech actually reiterated many of the same points that he's made in previous years, including the fact that declaring an end of war on the Korean Peninsula would help spur greater diplomacy towards denuclearization and peace. So with his term coming to an end next year, this was really his final speech at the UN, and he used it to make one final push for a peace declaration. What's notable is that he was a bit more concrete this time, and he specified that perhaps either the three parties of the two Koreas and the United States or four parties, including China, should be part of this effort.
Mr. Snyder, as Dr. Kim said, President Moon specifically mentioned the relevant parties, namely the US and China, saying they should come together in declaring the end of the war. In the similar speeches in 2018 or 2020, he didn't mention those countries. Why do you think he did this?
Well, I think he probably is trying to generate some political pressure and momentum in support of his proposal by actually naming countries and giving those countries a sense that they need to follow up. But I still think that as I read the speech by President Moon, rather than a song by BTS in the back of my head, I heard John Lennon's Imagine.
Why is the declaration of the end of the war so important for President Moon, Mr. Snyder?
Well, it's because the centerpiece of his foreign policy platform has been peace, and peace with North Korea in particular. And he's obviously invested a lot of effort in that objective. Unfortunately, the circumstances thus far have really not been propitious for him to achieve as much as he would have liked. But I think that he's been very consistent in his desire and in his perseverance toward that objective.
Dr. Kim, why does President Moon keep calling for this?
Well, as Scott laid out, President Moon's greatest policy priority has been improving North-South relations and advancing peace on the Korean Peninsula. And throughout his 5-year term, many different attempts have been made to advance this priority, from high-level summits to working-level negotiations to inter-Korean military agreements and so on. But as Scott pointed out, the unfortunate reality is that the Korean Peninsula isn't really much closer to permanent peace today than it was 5 years ago. And there are so many gaps between all of the parties who are involved on how to move forward on issues like denuclearization and sanctions relief. So it could be the case that the Moon administration thinks that signing an end of war declaration is a somewhat more achievable agenda that could be explored in the short term to try to draw North Korea to the table.
Dr. Kim, you just said that declaring the end of the Korean War is something achievable. Why is that?
As I said, I think there are many differences between the United States, and South Korea, of course, with North Korea and with China on how do you time sanctions relief to concrete steps that North Korea can make. And so these are harder issues to deal with. Presumably, these are things that need to be hashed out at the negotiating table. And so, rather than focusing on these very sticky issues, I think the logic is, why don't we focus on something symbolic that everyone could agree about, which is we need peace on the Korean Peninsula, and use that kind of declaration to insert momentum into negotiations. I think that's the logic behind the Moon administration.
And Mr. Snyder, could you share your thought as well?
Well, I think that the Moon administration has been tempted to place peace before denuclearization. And actually, that's where I think we see a bit of a gap with the United States, which really continues to focus on a peace and denuclearization approach, open to discussions about an end-of-war declaration, but only in the proper context, and only in a situation where it's clear that North Korea is ready to move forward in a reciprocal fashion to address the major concerns of the United States.
And North Korea gave out mixed signals. First, North Korea's vice foreign minister released a statement, what seemed like a rejection to a call to the declaration. As he said, the declaration of the end of the war would be a mere scrap of paper. And then later, Kim Yo-jong, the sister of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, said, it is an admirable idea. Mr. Snyder, what did you make of this?
Well, these were two different statements, possibly directed at two different audiences. The really interesting thing about the vice foreign minister statement is that it appears that Moon's end-of-war declaration proposal actually has united the U.S. and North Korea on the view that it's not worth pursuing unless there are substantive changes behind it in the U.S.-North Korea relationship. Many Americans would also say that an end-of-war declaration without those kinds of changes would be just a scrap of paper. And then with Kim Yo-jong, I think we have a slightly different situation. Kim Yo-jong, as she has emerged as a spokesman for North Korea, has been authoritative, but not always credible and not always final. And when I say that, I mean that her presentation of views may have ulterior motives. But what I think is significant is that when she was speaking during the Trump administration, it was very much focused on prospects for U.S.-North Korea relations in the context of symmetry. And it was really part of the Tongmi-Bongnam strategy. And now I think that we see that the tone and focus of Kim Yo-jong's statement has shifted to one that looks a little bit more like the Uri Minjokkiri, our nation together strategy that North Korea has used in the past. And both of these strategies are really designed to generate light and space between Washington and Seoul.
Dr. Kim, how did you interpret all this?
Well, I think it was very interesting that North Korea released these two statements back to back. The first one by the vice foreign minister. It was very clear that North Korea was dismissing the idea of an end-of-war declaration. I think his quote said that it would be a mere scrap of paper that would have no legal value. So it was quite clear that North Korea was not interested in discussing symbolic measures, and it was looking for something more concrete. I think later on, Kim Yo-jong's statement softened the tone a bit, and to say that, perhaps this declaration would be interesting and admirable. And I think, that was said as a gesture to the South Korean government, given the Moon administration's concerted efforts to keep up global interest in negotiations with North Korea. But again, the core of Kim Yo-jong's statement was the same, that Pyongyang is not interested for the time being in an end-of-war declaration.
The earlier message claimed the U.S. still has a hostile policy toward North Korea, and the latter message demanded South Korea's hostile policy be withdrawn. What kind of hostile policies are they talking about, Mr. Snyder?
Well, the North Koreans, I believe, see a lot of hostility from the United States, even though it's not often seen from the perspective of Washington. It is manifested in U.S. non-acceptance of North Korea's nuclear status. It's manifested in the application of sanctions toward North Korea and the rhetorical criticism of North Korea's leadership in many different areas. I might also note that as related to the sanctions issue, the North Koreans probably see the fact that in 2015, they had $2.7 billion of trade with South Korea. But under the Moon administration, they've only achieved $31 million. That's a high in 2018. As a source of frustration. On the other hand, it could be seen as evidence of the effectiveness of sanctions in creating discomfort and distress in North Korea.
Why do you think they released these two different statements just within a few hours? Is this North Korea's typical good cop, bad cop tactic, Dr. Kim?
Yeah, I think in some ways it is a good cop, bad cop tactic. And perhaps, it was planned to release these together in succession, or perhaps, the first was released and there was a reassessment in Pyongyang, that after that first sort of harsh message, it was important to leave at least a crack in the door open for diplomacy. What's interesting is that none of these statements have come directly from Kim Jong-un, which I think preserves space for Pyongyang to change its course. But again, as we discussed, I think despite the slightly different tones of the two statements, what's clear is that North Korea doesn't see much value in talks at this point.
Dr. Kim, Kim Yo-jong also said in the statement, smiling a forced smile, reading the declaration of the termination of the war, and having photos taken could be essential for somebody, but they would hold no water and would change nothing. What is she saying here? Is she asking for some conditions for the talks about the declaration to begin?
Well, I think her statement is perhaps a roundabout way of saying that North Korea is not interested in symbolic gestures or meetings. I think it feels like perhaps it didn't get much from the high-profile meetings between Trump and Kim in the past, and that it needs to see potential for concrete concessions before it's willing to engage, such as the offer of sanctions relief or rolling back elements of the US-ROK alliance, like military exercises that North Korea has long complained are threatening to its security. I think what's frustrating for many in the United States and South Korea is that in order to explore such reciprocal concessions, whether it's economic or military, North Korea has to come to the table and engage in discussions, but it has resisted doing so. So we're kind of with a chicken and an egg problem here.
Mr. Snyder, is she demanding some preconditions before declaring the end of the war?
In a manner of speaking, yes. I agree with what Patricia had to say. It's really about actions rather than words, I think, for the North Koreans, because they're looking for tangible benefits from engagement. And they don't want to just accept the idea that the war is over without seeing some relaxation, in particular, of sanctions. And I think that some of that was also perhaps reflected in the speech that Foreign Minister Chung made, the appearance that he made at the Council on Foreign Relations earlier this week, where he seems to suggest that sanctions relaxation could be used as an incentive to draw North Korea into talks. I'm not sure. I think there's still a gap between the U.S. and South Korea on that, but I think that was a very notable interpretation by Foreign Minister Chung.
Regarding President Moon Jae-in's proposal of the declaration of the end of the Korean War, the State Department said the U.S. remains committed to dialogue and diplomacy with North Korea. And earlier, the spokesperson for the Defense Department also reiterated the U.S. is committed to diplomacy and dialogue, and at the same time said the U.S. is open to discussing the possibility of an end of a war declaration. Mr. Snyder, what does this say about the U.S. stance on declaring the end of the war?
Well, I think that the priority remains on denuclearization, and I would actually add the readout from the Secretary of State Blinken's meeting with the South Korean and Japanese foreign ministers, where he reaffirmed complete denuclearization as a goal and really did not in public mention the end of war declaration. And so I think that that is a good indicator that from a U.S. perspective, the only viable approach is going to be a peace and denuclearization approach. It's not going to be a peace first. approach, and the Biden administration is not about to accept North Korea as a nuclear state.
Dr. Kim, what is the U.S. government's position on this?
Well, I think the Biden administration has been consistent with the fact that it's open to diplomacy and wants sustained diplomacy to work towards a concrete roadmap for the complete denuclearization and peace on the Korean Peninsula. It hasn't released any specific promises or made any specific demands, which I think reflects a firm belief in the US government that negotiations need to start at the working level and require substantive discussions that build towards concrete outcomes. In terms of the Defense Department spokesman's reference to the end of war declaration, I think this was not only a message to North Korea that, again, the United States is open to discussions, but it was also a way to express alliance solidarity towards South Korea, given that the Moon administration's great emphasis is on the issue. So while I think, a declaration is certainly possible in theory, it won't become a concrete reality until North Korea comes to the negotiating table.
Dr. Kim, when you look at all these circumstances surrounding North Korea, do you think the declaration is indeed possible?
Well, again, I think, it's certainly possible. The Biden administration has made clear that it's open to discussions, and end of war declaration could be part of those discussions. But, this is, of course, premised on the fact that North Korea is willing to engage. Having said that, I think there are a lot of priorities on the table for Washington, other than the Korean Peninsula, that are competing for the United States' time. And so perhaps North Korea senses that it's not a priority right now, and that's why it's not coming forth, because it feels like it's not the best time.
Mr. Snyder, what is your thought? Do you think the declaration of the end of the Korean War may actually be realized in the foreseeable future?
Well, I actually believe that a declaration of end of war is not possible under current circumstances. And the North Koreans have indicated very clearly that they believe a change in the U.S. hostile policy is necessary before that kind of discussion can occur. And I think that the U.S. would argue that North Korea has to come to the table serious about talking about denuclearization. And so I think that basically we just still see a clear gap between the U.S. and North Korean perspectives. And that's possibly going to lead to a further stalemate. The new wrinkle is that the North Koreans may be indicating a willingness to try to use South Korea as a way to put pressure on the Biden administration, if indeed we see some kind of momentum develop in the inter-Korean relationship following Kim Yo-jong's statement.
All right. In his speech at the UN, U.S. President Joe Biden briefly mentioned North Korea. He said the U.S. seeks serious and sustained diplomacy with concrete progress. Dr. Kim, what do you expect to happen now between the U.S. and North Korea?
Well, as you said, President Biden did indeed reference North Korea in his speech, although the reference was very brief, as you pointed out, and it was essentially a reiteration of his administration's policy. So I don't think there were any new ideas or a real sense of urgency, which, again, I think reflects the fact that North Korea, at least for now, is on the back burner for many states, not just Washington, given North Korea's lack of interest in diplomacy and many other pressing issues that have been occupying the administration's attention these last few months, like the withdrawal from Afghanistan or various alliance management challenges, and not to mention the COVID-19 pandemic and many other challenging domestic issues. And so I think there's a lot of competition for attention. Of course, if North Korea were to come out and express interest in talking, I think Sung Kim has made very clear that the U.S. is open to talking with no preconditions. And so I would imagine that could happen. But again, I think the onus is on North Korea to come to the table with serious propositions on denuclearization.
Mr. Snyder, where are the U.S. and North Korea headed?
I personally don't think that the U.S. and North Korea are really going to be headed anywhere at this time, and that most of the action, to the extent that there is going to be action, is going to be related to what can South Korea do to try to bridge the gap I think that North Korea, after a long period of failing to take advantage of the favorable attitude of the Moon administration, finally seems to be catching on to the idea that South Korea is the primary window or vehicle by which to potentially get to understandings with the U.S.
There may be a silver lining after South Korean President Moon Jae-in called for declaring the end of the Korean War. It is too early to make a prediction whether this will lead to some tangible progresses towards North Korea's denuclearization. Dr. Kim and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.